You're listening to the Common Fan Podcast, a Husker football podcast for the common fan, by the common fan.
Welcome back to the Common Fan Podcast. I am TJ Burkle with Matty Owens, Sr. and Geoff in Lincoln. This is episode 1 of a series called The Reckoning. From 1993 to 1997, as all Common fans know, the University of Nebraska dominated the college football universe in a way that few other programs ever have. With a record of 60-3, 4 conference championships, and 3 national championships, Tom Osborne built one of the greatest college football dynasties ever. History has shown that these dynasties never last. History has also shown, however, that things never needed to get as bad as they got for Nebraska football in the years following the Osborne era. The intent of the Reckoning series is to explore, analyze, and critique the leadership and decision-making of the post-Osborne era. As a fan podcast, part of our motivation here is to do a deep dive into the history of what transpired and to provide a place for fans to better understand what happened and why. We will examine the historical record and aim to assess it fairly and objectively. We will also spend some time airing our grievances and lamenting the failures of the recent years. We're the common fans, after all. We've got to indulge our grievance a little bit. But perhaps in doing so, we can play some small part in exercising whatever demons have possessed the program, helping to allow Nebraska football to move forward into a new era of broad, sunlit uplands, to borrow from Winston Churchill. Special guest Brandon Vogel is joining us for all of the Reckoning episodes. And for each episode, we will also have a featured guest, someone from the Nebraska sports media who covered the era being examined. Our featured guest for this episode is Mike Babcock. Brandon and Mike, great to have you with us today.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. The question we're exploring today is, what if Nebraska had never fired Frank Solich? We're going to dive into all the details surrounding the Solich area, and you, common fans, should consider diving into a steak from Certified Piedmontese. This premium Nebraska beef is raised and grazed in the beautiful Sandhills region of the state. They've got the best steaks, mouth-watering burgers, juicy beef kebabs, fall off the bone ribs, and so much more. Stop by your local Mercado Butcher Shop at 30th and Yankee Hill, or 84th and Havelock in Lincoln, or 162nd and Maple in Omaha. You can also go to cpbeef.com to get certified Piedmontese products shipped right to your front door, anywhere across all 50 states. Certified Piedmontese, powering the Husker football team and powering the Common Fan Podcast. All right, let's get right into it, gentlemen. One of the things we're going to do for each episode of this series, kind of to start, is to sort of look at the outlook or how things were going for Nebraska football when a given coach started or when a given coach was hired. Obviously, things were pretty good for Nebraska football when Frank Solich took over, succeeding one of the best to ever do it all time, Tom Osborne. But, in preparing for this episode, Mike, I went back and looked at Unbeatable by Henry Cordes. I don't know if you can see that. Anyway, it's a must read for all common fans out there, but was intrigued to, and I'd heard this story before, but it had been a while. Was intrigued to promise that Tom Osborne had made. So prior to the 1992 season, Coach Osborne gave Frank Solich a promise that he would coach for 5 more years. And his motivation in doing so was twofold. One, mainly, was to make sure Solich didn't take another job. And then he wanted Solich to succeed him too, so that he could keep his staff in place and keep as much continuity as possible. An interesting sidebar, by the way, that would have got him through the 1996 season. And when that season didn't go as well as they wanted it to, and Jason Peter and Grant Wistrom said they were coming back, Osborne went to Solich and said, "Hey, I know I said 5 years. I'd really like one more year." And so he stuck around for 1997, and I think we're all thankful that he did. But it's interesting, in the Cordis book, he talks about, a meeting after the 97 season had already started, when Osborne goes in to meet with then Nebraska Chancellor James Moser and then Athletic Director Bill Byrne, and basically tells them, I'm retiring at the end of the year, and I'd like you to hire Frank Solich to be my successor. Can you tell, I know a lot of this stuff about the promise came out years later, Mike, but what's your recollection of this era, or is there anything you can shed on kind of this decision of Osborne? Because if you read through this book, it seems to suggest that he was torn about it, and he was only 60 years old, and he was enjoying what he was doing, but he felt like he had to keep his promise to Solich.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that it was a little bit like what had happened with Bob Devaney and his decision to step aside. And in 1968, the story always went that on the bus ride back from Manhattan, Kansas, Bob called Tom to the front of the bus and said, "Hey, I'm getting to the point where I'm going to be ready to step aside here, and when I do, I want you to be the head coach." And Bob was the athletic director as well as the head coach and could make that decision. And I always thought that what Osborne did with Frank was a similar kind of a thing, is that he said, "Hey, I'm going to do this." He made in 1991, I think he made him assistant head coach, and the plan was that he was going to step aside and that Frank was going to succeed him. And he felt like if he didn't step aside, I think after the 97 season, there would be some possibility that Frank wouldn't have the opportunity to replace him. So you're right. I don't think that Tom, in retrospect, I don't think Tom was ready to step aside. I think he would have liked to continue coaching. But he had made that commitment to Frank, just as Bob had made a commitment to him, although he did he interviewed for a job or two after that, because he thought following Bob would be extremely difficult. And I think that put Frank in the same situation. He's following two Hall of Fame coaches.
Interesting. Well, and the book hits on that too. And Devaney made that promise going into the 69 season, I think it was. And then said, "Well, I need one more." Like then he stuck around through 70, or maybe it was going into the 70 season, whatever it was. But then he stuck around through, I think, 1972. And that was another motivation for Osborne. He asked Solich basically to, allow him one more year, even though he had given his word, but he didn't want to do any more than that after 1997.
Yeah, Bob said that Bob had told Tom, and again, there was the story about the bus ride in 68. The commitment might have come in 69, but he said after the 71 season that he was going to step aside. And okay. Tom had actually made some decisions on Jerry Moore. He had committed to hiring Jerry Moore for the 72 season. And then after Nebraska won back-to-back national titles, Bob was persuaded to stay another year to try to win 3 in a row. That's what so he went to Tom and said, "Hey, we're going to go one more season and then you can follow me." And Tom had to tell Jerry Moore that, "Hey, you don't have a job here in 72. You're going to have to wait till 73. And I think Jerry Moore was at North Texas at the time, and went back and I can't remember the coach's name now. He coached at Iowa.
Hayden Fry.
Hayden Fry was coaching at he was coaching Jerry Moore, and Jerry Moore had to go back to him at North Texas and say, "Hey, could I have one more season here?" And Hayden Fry said yes, he could. So it worked out okay for Jerry Moore.
Interesting. So another thing that the Cordis book suggests is that Bill Byrne didn't immediately accept the suggestion of Solich. And he actually, like any AD, Bill Byrne's got his list. And the names on it, interestingly, Mac Brown, who was at North Carolina at the time, Phil Fulmer, who was at Tennessee at the time, and Jim Tressel, who was at Youngstown State at the time. But given Osborne's sort of insistence, Byrne at least committed to saying, he didn't know Solich for that well at the time. He said, I'll get to know Frank better. He wanted to be respectful to Osborne, and ultimately, obviously, hired Solich. To your recollection, was there any sort of coaching search? Were any other candidates considered, or was Solich kind of the heir apparent and that's the way it played out?
And my perception of it was he was the heir apparent, because Tom had committed to him, and what Tom did, that's how things played out, so that if Tom made a commitment to him, it was going to happen, even though Tom wasn't in the same situation as Bob when he replaced Bob, because Bob was the athletic director and he could control it. But I think Tom had established himself to the point that he had enough respect that, hey, now, his thought that if I don't step aside here at 96 or 97, Frank's not going to maybe be my replacement. Maybe there was some things going on behind the scenes, but to my recollection, there wasn't anything. It was what Tom said was going to happen, and that was going to happen.
Right. Well, I mean, how do you go against the great Dr. Tom Osborne's wishes? I don't know how anyone in this state could get away with that. But Mike, after the transition had been made, the move had been made to name Frank Solich the head coach. As a media member covering the team, from your perspective, were things pretty seamless? Is it kind of one of those things where there's a different head man in charge, but I think that to my knowledge and my recollection, most of the rest of the staff was kept intact. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't remember that correctly, but were things pretty seamless?
I thought they were. One of the things is that Charlie McBride was ready to retire, and would have retired when Tom did, except Tom had talked to Charlie and said, hey, would you stick around for a season or two to help in the transition? And so Charlie stayed as defensive coordinator for 2 seasons before he retired. That was at the request of Tom. The one thing I never really was convinced about was when you talk about seamless, the assistants that stayed, I think there was some belief on the staff that even though they stayed, they didn't think that Frank should have been the guy. There was probably that feeling that, hey, I should be the guy, or, I don't know how much behind the scenes support Frank had. And
Interesting.
I've talked to other people about this, and as it went along, it seemed to me, and again, this is just me, but my perception was it was almost like Frank was in a bunker with Dave Gillespie. There wasn't a lot of support from the longtime assistant coaches thinking that he should be the coach.
Wild.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and TJ mentioned it before. Like, it's been so long since that era. Like, we were in high school back then, and so from my perspective, like at that age, I had only known Nebraska football as the dominant program that it's always been. And kids today that were so far beyond that, they don't even remember or even know about what those days were like. But when Nebraska would play, I would just expect them to be good. And so even when Coach Osborne retired, I think it was my expectation, but I think it was probably the fan base's expectation, was that it was just going to be business as usual. Yeah, we got a different coach, but we're just going to go out there and dominate the way that we always have, because I had never known anything different. That was me. But did you get a general feel? Is that how the fan base felt as a whole? That's how I felt about it, but I'm not sure if everybody was probably on the same boat as me.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody was on the same page, but again, you have to consider Tom thought it was going to be difficult to follow a Hall of Fame coach like Bob Devaney, who had just won 2 national championships in his final 3 years. Now, Frank is following not only Tom, who won 3 national championships in his final 5 years and conceivably could have won 4, maybe 5, And Bob Devaney before that, he's following now 2 Hall of Fame coaches who had 5 national championships. That's a difficult do, regardless of who the coach is. And, I don't know if the fans looked at it that way. It's just like, well, we got a new coach, let's just keep going. And there was this perception, and I saw this even more so when Bill Callahan was hired to replace Frank, was that there was this attitude that, well, Alabama has had a slide. All the major programs have had a slide that they've come back. Oklahoma came back or whatever. And it seemed like when Callahan was here, he went 5-7 his first year, and people were like, well, there's the downslide. Now we're ready to go back and win games. They weren't ready for any kind of a significant downslide. But as far as Frank being the coach, I just think that there was this feeling that the program had this momentum, and it didn't matter if Frank was the coach or whomever, it was going to keep going. And you found out that in his tenure that it wasn't going to be quite the same as what you thought. The other thing I would say is he's following 2 Hall of Fame coaches, and he's adjusting to a new conference. I know Tom had 2 seasons in that, but Frank had the entirety of his tenure was in this new conference that was now run by Texas. I thought it was funny when Chancellor Graham Spanier spoke to the media about the addition of the Texas schools to the conference. He said, nothing's going to change. We're just expanding the Big 8. We're just adding schools. Well, everything changed. They moved from Kansas City. They moved the conference offices from Kansas City into Texas, and Texas took over. And there was, because Nebraska had been so dominant towards the end of Tom's tenure, there was always this feeling that whenever there was a vote in the conference, it was usually Nebraska voting against 11, because the old Big 8 schools were like, well, Nebraska, they won all these championships and whatever, so we're gonna vote with the Texas schools. It was that was a factor, I think. But again, from a fan standpoint, I don't think they looked at it that way. I think they thought it's just going to go on,
Yeah, same.
Brandon, do you have any thoughts or recollections on that sort of initial phase of the end of the Osborne era and Solich taking over?
Yeah, not so many recollections. I mean, I was living in Nebraska, 1998. I was a freshman in college, so I was kind of following it, from a bit of a remove, at least. I think one thing that jumps out to me as Mike was talking there is that it's not just that Nebraska was very good, and that's what Frank Solich was trying to follow up. Like, they were good to a not quite unprecedented, but like upper top one of the 1%, in terms of college football history, and just how long they did it. I mean, they fell out of the top 25, the AP top 25, I think in 1981 after a loss to Iowa, came back the next week, and then they would be ranked until 2002. So for my entire life, up until 2002, when I was 23 years old, Nebraska, well, from 2 to 23 years old, Nebraska had never not been a part of the AP poll. And I mean, it's just, when it's so constant like that, you're just constantly a part of the conversation nationally. It's hard to know what different looks like, and especially when you see it kind of gradually, it's kind of hard to assess, I think, where things are going, which I'm sure we'll get into in this later on and in later episodes. So yeah, it was, and also I think the notion. So Nick Saban retired this year. I think one of the predominant sentiments was like, who wants to follow that? And that's always kind of been there. I think that reaction, though, is a little bit more modern than what things may have been 20 years earlier, where it was just a little bit more assumed that, like, well, Nebraska's always been Nebraska. They'll keep being Nebraska. And if Frank Solich is who Tom Osborne wants, then, who are we to question? It's just it's kind of a different climate too.
Right. Spot on. So Solich takes over in 1998. And I think we can think about his tenure in two parts, kind of, because from 1998 to 2001, things looked pretty good. Nebraska, for the most part, was Nebraska. And we'll get into 02 and 2003 in a minute. But Solich posted a 9-4 record in 1998 with a loss to Arizona in the Holiday Bowl. The 1999 team might have been his best team. They were 12-1 with a conference championship. They beat Tennessee in the Fiesta Bowl, but for a 24-20 loss to a major Applewhite-led Texas team. That team is probably playing for the national championship, right? I mean, that was very close to, it was a national championship caliber team. Absolutely. They went 10-2 in 2000 with a victory over Northwestern in the Alamo Bowl. And then, of course, 2001, that one seared into my brain for so many reasons. They go 11-2. It was an odd season in some ways because they had a 17-point drubbing of Notre Dame. You had the famous black 41 flash reverse pass to Eric Crouch to propel them to victory over number 2 Oklahoma. I mean, I think I remember that moment, that win sort of being like, okay, like that we're going to win it all this year. I really felt that way. And then there was the meltdown loss to Colorado over Thanksgiving weekend. And then the fairly one-sided loss to Miami in the Rose Bowl for the national title. Of course, Crouch wins the Heisman that year. And I was just another side note, but I have this memory. I don't know if this is like a Brian Williams thing where I just made this up in my head, but I'm pretty sure I remember watching, because we had lost to Colorado and hadn't even played for the conference title. Colorado went on and won the conference, right? And I remember then it was the first year of the BCS. So it was all about putting everything into the computer, into the system, and whatever the system spit out, Miami was the clear-cut number 1 team, and whatever the system spit out, number 2 team would play. And I'm fairly certain I remember Solich and Gary Barnett, split screen side by side on ESPN as they announced it from the BCS. And Nebraska won. We got in the game by what, a 100th of a percentage point or whatever it was. It was so close. But anyway, kind of got exposed against that Miami team. And then of course, sorry if I mentioned this, Solich was Big 12 Coach of the Year in 1999 and 2001. So, I think those first 4 years, and a lot of people have made the argument that Tom Osborne, those are a lot of Osborne recruited players, and maybe that had something to do with it. But that felt a lot like the Osborne era. We won a conference championship. We played for a national championship. We were in the top, not just top 25 or top 10. We were a top 5 team several weeks, throughout multiple of those seasons. It certainly felt like it was going to work to the point that was discussed just a minute ago, and that we were just going to keep being Nebraska. I'm kind of curious, Mike, in your mind, what was the high point of those first 4 years before the 02 season came along and kind of turned everything on its head?
I think you mentioned 2 things. One, the Oklahoma game in 2001. I think that was because Nebraska was number 3 ranked and Oklahoma was number 2 ranked. That was a big one for me, and it was kind of like the last hurrah. There's where the program reached where it was going to be, and then it was downhill after that, because not too long after that you had the loss to Colorado. The other thing is probably the Big 12 championship game victory against Texas after you'd lost to Texas in the regular season. Gave you the opportunity to beat Texas, for one thing, which was no small matter. And I think Nebraska finished number 3 in the Associated Press poll and number 2 in the coaches poll, or one, something like that. So I thought that was kind of the highlight, as good as it gets. And then you kind of fall off the cliff with the loss to Colorado. And, losing to Miami, that was an outstanding Miami team. There were several players that went on to play in the NFL off that team. So I didn't think that was any disgrace. But again, I think that Oklahoma game that year, because there was such a tradition, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and to win, number 3 beats number 2. I thought that was a big win from my standpoint. But probably the best season, as you pointed out, for Frank was '99, and that was the last year that Charlie was the defensive coordinator, and things kind of fell into place.
Yeah, and TJ, I just want to go back to something you had mentioned before. I used the word drubbing for Notre Dame and their 17-point loss at home.
It was a drubbing.
I don't consider 17 points a drubbing, but potato, to each their own. That's fine.
It was. I was at that game, Jeff. It was a drubbing.
Or
domination.
Jeff, if you'd like, we could talk about the next year when we went to South Bend and took over the stadium and won that game as well. We can talk about that.
That's fine. We don't have to go into that. You know, I just do want to say that, you know, drubbing is a strong word, and I feel like you were taking a shot at me there. So I'll let that one slide. That's fine. Because I want to be polite in front of our guests. So
Mike and Brandon, for your reminder that Geoff is a Husker fan. We have to remind ourselves of that. Sometimes grew up in a Notre Dame household as well, so he's got a fair amount of affinity for Notre Dame. I think he's taking this a little bit personally right now, but in any event, it was a drubbing, Jeff.
Notre Dame was one of the best. When I look back at the places when I traveled, road games, it was one of the best places I ever went. I mean,
beautiful.
I thought it was really a stadium was cool. There weren't advertising signs in the stadium.
All class.
It was really, it was nice.
Touche.
Yeah, just as a civilian, not as a media member, I was lucky to be at that game in South Bend, and also at that Oklahoma game in Lincoln, which I think for me that's got to be the high point. Though I agree with Mike, my second choice would be the '99 Big 12 championship game, and we're about to hit a pretty steep drop off because for me. In my early 20s at that point, those games felt like Nebraska was still at the center of college football. And then you get to 2002 and it's a pretty brisk change right away.
Yeah. And, talking about going back to the Colorado loss, people look back at that now as a kind of a canary in the coal mine. Was there a sense that, things were really kind of slipping after those 2 back-to-back losses, Colorado and Miami in 2001? Or, do you remember people kind of thinking, we'd just pick right back up and be competing for conference titles and national titles in 2002?
I don't think people thought, we've just totally fallen off the cliff. I think you look at that in retrospect, it's kind of looks like that's what happened. But again, from my point of view, Miami was a really good team. And that one didn't fit in with what happened at Colorado for me. What happened at Colorado was just shock. And I did, obviously I didn't think Nebraska should be playing Miami. I thought Colorado should have been. And from that standpoint, it's like you don't belong in this game for one thing, and for another thing, it's a really good Miami team. So, we'll set that aside and we'll move on. The one thing that I would say, and I'm oversimplifying the situation, but I think that recruiting was a big factor in the fall off. And the example that I use, and I'm oversimplifying, but if you look at the difficulty that Solich had in recruiting quarterbacks, like his first recruiting class didn't have any quarterbacks. His second recruiting class, and this is because you got Crouch and you got Bobby Newcomb, they're competing at one point. His second recruiting class included Carl Crawford and Jamal Lord, and Crawford signed baseball contract, and Jamal, he was a great running quarterback, I thought, and he had the difficult situation of replacing a Heisman Trophy winner, Eric Crouch, and Jamal was uncomfortable talking to reporters. I always got that sense, and it made sense to me. Okay, Frank's third recruiting class, no quarterbacks. His fourth recruiting class, Mike McLaughlin and Mike Stuns. Then you Kurt Dukes in his next recruiting class, adios. And you had in his last recruiting class, Joe Daly, who was a good fit for what Frank did, but he wasn't a good fit for what Bill Callahan was trying to do. So I think that, the quarterback situation was reflective of recruiting, how it had sort of slid, and you understood why it was difficult to get quarterbacks then, probably because of who was here. But then when Crouch finished, who's your guy? Jamal Lord steps in and is a great running quarterback and is overlooked for, I think, often for what he did. But if Carl Crawford would have come here, who knows? Jamal might have been an All-American safety.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting perspective, Mike. I wasn't really thinking about the quarterback recruiting. I guess for me, from a common fan perspective, definitely I'm with you that the Miami loss, anybody would have gotten just completely dominated and drubbed by Miami that year, I think, in the title game. I think the one that sticks with me is Colorado loss and how it happened. It was basically just them handing the ball off to Chris Brown and Bobby Purify and just gashing our defense. So I'm with you on the recruiting thing, but for me it was like, gosh, did our defense get slower? Like it just felt like we were tough and physical, but when we had teams that had a little bit more speed on offense, it just seemed to be starting to be a problem at that point. But that's just a common fan's perspective.
And it felt like it happened overnight, Matty-O,
right?
Because we had been so good that year and we beat Oklahoma. And I remember watching that game, like one long run after another and thinking, like, at some point it hit me like, I don't think we're going to stop them tonight. Like, I don't think we're going to come back and win this game. Like for a while it was like, okay, joke's over, guys. Like, let's get serious and win this game. And we just never started making stops. And that was just so to your point, Mike, it was shocking. It was jarring. It was unbelievable. But I don't know, at least from my perspective, we were in college at the time, but I don't think I thought at that point it was a precursor of things to come or anything like that. It was just like, wow, what a bad night,
Right. The hope was that it was just a terrible, terrible nightmare one-off scenario.
Right, exactly.
I mean, the score of that game almost lends itself to that point of view. I mean, it was 62-36. It's like so outside the norm that I think only in retrospect can you kind of look back and be like, oh, there was like the crack in the foundation that was just going to grow. But I mean, I guess counterpoint to that, Nebraska was who it was to that point because nobody beat them like that. I mean, for a stretch, they struggled in bowl games against the Florida schools, but that was like 20-3, lost to Miami. It wasn't 60. Giving up 62 points was crazy.
Yeah. Well, let's shine a light on that 2002 season, painful as it may be. So the Huskers fall to 7-7, including a loss to Ole Miss in the Independence Bowl. At the time, it was the team's first time without 9 wins since 1968, first time without a winning record since 1961, which is just incredible to the point made earlier about the run of excellence in Nebraska football for decades, really. So after the 0-2, and I remember, like you guys remember, the sky was falling. Husker Nate, like it was like a continuation of the Colorado game. Nobody knew what to do. Everyone was shocked. What is going on here with this beloved program of ours? And so after the 0-2 season, Solich fired 3 coaches, defensive coordinator Craig Bull, secondary coach George Darlington, and rush ends coach Nelson Barnes. 2 other longtime assistants, Dan Young and Milt Tenopir, were retired, maybe forced to retire. I don't know. It was also announced that Solich would be giving up offensive play calling duties. So he's got a revamped staff going into 2003. That team goes 9-3. The defense was drastically improved under the young new defensive coordinator, a guy by the name of Bo Pelini. They forced a school record 44 turnovers. But it wasn't like we were all the way back. The losses were glaring. They lost by 17 to Missouri, lost by 24 to Texas. And if you go back and read a lot of the coverage at the time of Solich's firing and some of the coverage in retrospect, a lot of people talk about the 29-point loss, 38-9 against Kansas State, as kind of a big one. Another point I found interesting, Solich lost 12 of his last 28 games against ranked teams in his last 2 seasons, including 8 of his last 9 against ranked teams. And of course, he was fired on November 29th, 2003. Actually went out on a victory after beating Colorado 31-22. So he was 8-3. And then the team went on to win the Alamo Bowl. I want to say it was 17-3 over Michigan State. I was actually at that bowl game with Pelini as the interim head coach. So they finished 9-3. So that kind of brings us to the crux of what this episode is all about, sort of the firing of Frank Solich and considering what had happened if they hadn't fired Frank Solich. So then athletic director Steve Pederson's famous line, of course, from the time is, quote, "I refuse to let the program gravitate to mediocrity. We will not surrender the Big 12 conference to Oklahoma and Texas." He, of course, had the full support of then Chancellor Harvey Perlman, who's a character who will have an ongoing role in this whole saga over several of our episodes here. But I found an interesting Daily Nebraskan article from the time, quoting Perlman as saying, "I personally support and concur with the decision Pederson's made." According to that Daily Nebraskan article, the consideration of firing Solich had been ongoing for months. A quote from the story, quote, "Pederson and Perlman said Sunday that upon Pederson's hire almost 11 months ago, both were concerned about the direction of the football program and its leadership. Pederson, though, danced around questions asking when he specifically decided to end Solich's tenure." Interestingly, Pederson was hired around, I think it was December 2002 or January of 2003. It was because Bill Byrne took the A&M job. But, Mike, I'm curious about, if you have any recollections here, was part of the thinking with bringing Pederson in after that 2002 season? I mean, I don't think they would have looked to replace Bill Byrne. He happened to be leaving, but did Perlman or others in university leadership take that opportunity to say, let's go get someone to fire Frank Solich? Was he brought in to do that?
I never got the sense that he was brought in to do that. I always got the sense that Steve was brought in because, they thought he could be a good replacement for Bill Byrne. He had been in the athletic department first as in the media department. That's where he started as a student assistant, I think. And then he'd been involved in recruiting, and he had moved up. So he had the experience in Nebraska, and he was a Nebraskan. And, he came from a family of very successful people. His dad was a state senator. His brother started up a company, I think, in Atlanta or somewhere, and it was very successful, sold it. So, you had a very aggressive guy coming in, I think. And I think Steve was trying to, from my perspective, and I was on the other side. I mean, Steve maintained contact with me from going back to when he had been in the athletic department in other capacities. And he would call me and say, I saw this in the World Herald, why are they ripping me? Why are they doing this? And I just try to talk to him, because that's what friends do. But when I'd see him in public, he'd kind of walk past me. He'd kind of ignore me. And my wife got pretty upset about that. And I said, friends are friends, if they need you, you do what you do. And if they walk on past you when they're in your public, that's the way it is. But I never got the sense that he was brought in specifically to do that. But I do think that he wanted to be aggressive. He wanted to establish his own sort of, he kind of tried to wipe out the immediate history of that preceded him and, set up his own kind of a thing. And, he told me once early on, he said, Mike, it's recruiting is an important part of what we do. And it's a fine line for us. If we fall off that line on the wrong side, it's going to be difficult to get back. I mean, I think he understood the situation. I just don't know that he handled it very well. And I think some of it was personal, that he was trying to make a name for himself in this situation. And, that it didn't work out. And, now, could there have been, Chancellor Perlman could have been involved in this? There's no question about that because of what, that Daily Nebraskan article. I saw that you sent it out and there seemed to be that. I know over the long term, Chancellor Perlman's two biggest concerns were, one, getting in the Big 12 or getting in the Big 10, I'm sorry. And two, getting Innovation Campus going. I mean, those were his overall big things, I think. But, football is a part of the university at that point. It's definitely a significant, get your name out there where Nebraska had been. And you want to maintain that as best you can. So very possible that he could have been involved. I mean, he had to be involved at some level, right? Because he's the chancellor.
Right. Mike, you'd said he was aggressive and rightfully so. Is it normal for an athletic director to fire a coach that quickly, like less than a year into his tenure here? Is that a normal thing, or is that completely off the wall bonkers to you?
It kind of surprised me, and just a little anecdote that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with anything. With Steve Sipple and I were standing down beyond the end zone at the Colorado game when Nebraska won that game. And I remember Sip turning to me and saying, well, he can't fire Frank now, can he? With this win. And we went to the news conference, and it was pretty clear what was going to happen at that post-game news conference at Colorado. And everybody, was hustling to get back to Lincoln because there was, they thought we were going to find out something fairly quickly. And I think it was a day or not the next day, but I think it was that Saturday that when they got back, I think that Frank was told, and then they didn't announce it until maybe a day later. Yeah, I don't think to me, it's not, okay, here we got a relatively new athletic director. Coach is gone after 1 year. That's so, maybe that was the plan.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's normal, but worth noting, Osborne had to do that with Callahan. I don't remember how many months he was on the job. And then Moose did it with Riley. The big difference there being both Moose and Osborne, what was supposed to be an interim role, were replacing fired ADs who got fired because football wasn't going well. So right. Not quite the same situation, but if you look broadly of like, why has Nebraska been where it has been over the past 20 some years? I think having three athletic directors have to, or choose to, fire the coach, the head football coach, within their first 12 months on the job, that's probably not a great sign of health.
Right. And then, just the fact that, the majority of athletic directors kind of, in my opinion, kind of want to make their stamp on a program and get their guy in there too. But yeah, I don't think it's usually within the first 12 months on the job. But going back to Chancellor Perlman, this won't be the first time that we see him in this saga of the coaching carousel that we've had. Do we know what his motivations were, and are chancellors normally as prominent in football coaching hires as Chancellor Perlman seemed to be?
That's difficult for me to say, because I think that the Osborne's tenure was 25 years as head coach. So you don't really get a sense of where the chancellor fits into all that sort of thing. And then when you start changing coaches, I think the chancellor probably is involved to some degree in each of those situations, because I think that's, overall, again, it's reflective of the university. In Nebraska's case, definitely, it's a high profile aspect of the University of Nebraska, and it generates revenue for the university and for the athletic department, and so I think the chancellor has to be involved in it from that standpoint. Chancellor Perlman was chancellor from 2002 to 2016. Through that whole period of transitions, he's there. So I think he probably had some say in it. But like I said, he had, I think, 2 major projects as things went along, and one was to get into the Big Ten, and to do that, you had to have Tom Osborne involved, and that's where Tom was the athletic director, and that was important, I think. If Nebraska was going to get in the Big Ten, Tom had to be involved. And then the other thing was Innovation Campus, which is not directly related to football.
Right. I think if we would have had, if one of these coaches over the last 20 years would have worked out a little bit better, I think Harvey Perlman would be a little bit less known name in Husker fandom. It's kind of one of those things where we're always looking to figure out who's to blame for any of these situations, and his name's come up quite a bit with other Husker fans I've talked to.
He's the leading candidate for villain of this story, Matt.
Right. He's we always try to connect Star Wars and Husker football in this podcast. The 3 of us common fans being Star Wars fans, and Chancellor Palpatine, Chancellor Perlman.
And
no coincidence.
I gotta be truthful about this whole thing. Chancellor Perlman is from my hometown, York High School.
Okay.
He went to York High. I went to York High, and so I know him probably a little better than most people would. But his brother was in my class, actually, and so I'm probably kinder, maybe his word, than would be appropriate.
That makes
sense. You're clearly a very kind man in general, Mike. We will probably not be so classy, but we won't ask you to say anything you don't want to say. All right, so just some other points to consider here, guys, as we're talking about this. Solich was a 25-year veteran of the coaching staff. Obviously, he played fullback for Devaney in the 60s. He was an assistant to Osborne, for 19 years before he took over as head coach. As head coach, he compiled a 58-19 record, and as we discussed, he won a conference title, played for a national title. And yet, I think my recollection is, and I was in college, so I probably wasn't consuming as much of the newspaper as I do today. And so maybe this was just very anecdotal conversations with friends. My recollection is that many Husker fans sided with Pederson when Solich was fired in 2003. Again, the sky was falling after that 2002 season. And, it was unfathomable that we wouldn't have a winning record. And it's easy to look back now after the roller coaster of the last 25 years and say it was a mistake. And maybe it's just recency bias. My recollection, my sense is that there's been a lot more division in the fan base and fighting in the fan base over the Pelini firing than there was over the Solich firing. That I could be wrong on that. I'd love to hear any and all of your takes on that. But I think when Pederson talked about not seeding the Big 12 and Husker fans thought about, wait a second, we should be playing for national titles every year. I remember a friend saying to me, Solich could go 8-4 for the next 10 years, and being like, yeah, that's right. Gee whiz, and it's like how terrible that
Right.
sounded, So I'm curious what you guys thought of whether fan reactions, media reactions. Obviously, it was a huge story. It was a national story, but I feel like in Nebraska, it was kind of like, okay, like we're going to get with the times here. We're not going to run the option anymore. We're going to take this thing to the next level and start winning championships again.
I think a lot of the media, you always have to maintain your objectivity. I think that's difficult sometimes when you have dealt with somebody for as long as most of the media members had dealt with Frank, over that period of time. So I think it was difficult from that standpoint. It's just like Sip saying to me, at that Colorado game, I don't think they can fire him now, can they? Kind of thing, because you felt like, Frank deserved. Let's see what happens here. That we're making a snap decision. And one thing I should have mentioned earlier, I think not only recruiting, but Frank's decision to try to be offensive coordinator and head coach, as Tom had been, was a mistake. I don't think very many coaches can do that. You can't be a coordinator and be a head coach. You have to be, as a head coach, you have to be concerned about all aspects of things. Tom was he was a unique in that sense. Okay. And so, yeah, the media, I don't know if there was a lot of, it was just kind of an objective thing. This is going to happen. It looks like this is going to happen here. In the back of your mind, when Sip says that, he knows what's going to happen. We got that sense. That's why we're hustling back to Lincoln to see what's going to happen, because we know, or we got the sense of what's going to happen. And I think the fans did too, probably because of what the media sensed, that it was going to turn this way. But even though you might have anticipated it, it's still kind of a stunner when you see that news conference and this is what's happened. Goodbye, Frank, and Bo's going to step in for the bowl game, and then we're going to go from there. And Bo thinks he's going to be the head coach. He steps into the bowl and he's really upset when he's not named the head coach. It takes some problems for Bill Callahan to get Bo to the situation that he's in. But Bo, the thing about Bo's teams always won at least 9 games and went to bowl games. There were just some nasty losses in there.
Yeah. Brandon, any thoughts on that question of sort of the reaction to the Solich firing, or the mood of the fan base, or that sort of piece of it?
Yeah, what I can add. So I was living in Boston at that time. So obviously not working in that, and well, I was a long ways away from working in media. So I was pretty removed in terms of determining like maybe what the popular sentiment was. I can say that I personally felt that way as an observer of Nebraska. Not that I was like, Solich is gone, good, get that bum out of here. It was a hard call, I thought. But I could see the recruiting piece of it, the angle there. And I could see the kind of need to update and get ready for kind of what college football is going to become. And, as kind of mentioned earlier, Nebraska had been, the standard was so impossibly high for literally the entire time I was alive to that point, that what Solich was actually doing probably felt worse than it really was in
Right.
reality. So all those things kind of combined for me. I remember the day that the press conference happened and the firing happened, and I was like, no, that's too bad. But yeah, I can kind of see it, and maybe some of that's just like age. I think when you're younger, you're a little bit more apt to be like, what's next? Let's do it. And I think that was kind of what I remember of my sentiment from that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, it's time for the final verdict of the Common Fans. The question of the day is, what if Nebraska had never fired Frank Solich? Now, I don't think this is an easy one. It's obviously not a yes or no question. So it lends itself to a few questions. My first one is, if Nebraska had stayed the course with Solich, do we think, could he have gotten the program back to where it was with Osborne? And that's probably not a fair comparison. So, or somewhere close, right? So let's not, winning 3 national championships in 4 years is something very few programs have ever done. I don't know of any program that, maybe Alabama in recent years, but other than that, I don't know of any programs who's done it twice, right? But could he have gotten back to, even the 99 team or the 01 team of competing for national championships? Mike, what do you think about that?
Competing for national championships. That's I don't know. The thing, probably not, because again, you're making the transition into the Big 12. You're still doing that. You're still trying to adjust your offense and your mindset and your recruiting and everything that goes into that transition. That wasn't where his background was, obviously. But I think that Nebraska would have benefited from keeping him on now, not forever. I mean, maybe not as long as he was at Ohio or whatever it was, but I just thought it was interesting that the announcement of the decision was made when Osborne wasn't here. He was away, and Pederson. I felt like if Steve Pederson would have listened to Osborne, I think things might have turned out a little bit differently in how the transition was handled, and should it have been handled at that point or whatever. But Steve was his own person. He was going to make his own decisions, kind of a thing. But from my point of view at the time, I thought, no, you should keep Frank on. The things are going to go badly here. Let's see what happens. 1 7-7 season, and I know it had happened since '61. No, keep him on.
I've always thought too, okay, he completely turns over the staff after the 02 season. They show improvement in 03, going 9-3. And again, there were some bad losses in there. Maybe it wasn't back to the standard Husker fans wanted, but I've always thought you've got to give the guy more time then. You've got to at least give him a few more years to say, and there was pressure from Osborne to keep the staff, the original staff. Like maybe Frank wanted to make some of those decisions sooner than he did too, right? So I think he finally got to hire his own staff. They improved in 03. And so my take was always, I don't know if he could have gotten back to Osborne levels or not, but you've got to give the guy more time. At least a couple more years.
I think
Brandon,
sorry, TJ, you mentioned your friend that you spoke to that said we're looking at 8-4 every year. And I think that's what it would have been. I think probably winning 8-9 games a year, which now we look at that and say, God, that sounds great. But it's the same thing we make fun of Iowa for, right? But it's, because you want to shoot for something a little bit better than that. If you're 8-9 wins every year, then people are going to want 10, 11, 12 wins. But I think he was a good enough coach that's what we would have been. It would have been 8-9 wins a year. And, that sounds great now.
Not 8 wins. Can't have 8 wins. Got to have at least 9. Not 8.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still a tough one, and I try to play it out like if Solich had been retained, and I think this is one of the early signs, and I think it'll come up as we go through some of these other changes, that of the importance between the alignment between the athletic director and the football coach. And I mean, that's true for all sports, but we're talking about football here. And, for Steve Pederson, he came out very strong, with the statement, we're not going to let this program gravitate towards mediocrity. There's a hint of and I'm the guy who sees it and will fix it, which is fine at the time. But it's hard. There were some pieces I'm kind of a numbers guy that I dig into that stuff. you mentioned the record 58-19 over that stretch. 37, 38, and 2 against the spread, which I don't care about for gambling purposes. I wasn't flying to Vegas and losing money on because of Frank Solich by any means. But I look at that as a way of like, our team's playing up to or above or below expectation. And if you're 500, you're just you're like, yeah, you win the games you should, you lose the games you don't. You kind of play about exactly as expected. So being a little bit below 500 is kind of average. You mentioned the record against ranked teams. That's a piece of it too, though. I think he was 11-13 over that span, which isn't that bad against ranked teams. Tom Osborne was 500 in bowl games, which he probably played a ranked team all the time in bowl games at that point. So if you string it out and say, so they brought in Barney Cotton to be OC for that 2003 season. At what point are you moving away from the option? Interesting enough, I don't know if anybody remembers Tim Albin. He's the head coach at Ohio now. Took over for Solich there after Solich unfortunately had to retire due to some health issues late in the cycle. I think it was in summer, so they kind of had to. But the point is, Tim Albin started his major college career as a GA at Nebraska, and then he was Solich's offensive coordinator when he took the Ohio job in 2005 and stayed that entire time, which we're not talking about the 70s and 80s and 90s then. We're talking about the 2000s where that kind of thing doesn't happen. And he's won 10 games twice the last 2 seasons at Ohio. So if Nebraska needed to update its offense, it may have very well had the guy already in the office who could have helped them do that. I think bottom line, I think Frank Solich was going to be a 8-9 win coach. So no, you're not getting back to the Osborne era. And in some ways, I think it almost exists as kind of a tax for all of the success Nebraska had between 1962 and 2002 or 2001, that Nebraska's not getting out of this deal without firing a 9-win coach at some point. And they've done it twice with pretty poor results. But I just think you can only continue that for so long if you're Solich. At a certain point, people are going to be like, well, there's got to be more out there. I mean, we saw it happen with Pelini, 5 years down the line when he took over and then, spent 7 seasons.
Yeah. And I think, you kind of alluded to this, Brandon, with, people kind of wanted to see, Solich's offense, to me, got so quarterback driven, and it was a run heavy offense, but it became a quarterback run heavy offense. And it made sense because we had Eric Crouch, and then you had Jamal Lord, who's a running quarterback, but it was so quarterback run driven. And, I think we're going into an era where, it's Urban Meyer and Chip Kelly and these high flying offenses where, yeah, the quarterback can run, but they're not called up running plays usually for the quarterback. And then you've got the shifting of the college football power center to more to the southeast part of the country, and you just wonder if Solich would have been able to adapt to the changing landscape of college football that was kind of just around the corner at the time. So, and I don't know if any of you have anything to add to that or there's an answer to that, but just making observations, I guess, more than anything.
I mean, I think his Ohio years showed that he did in some key ways. And it was interesting, Mike was recounting the struggles to land quarterbacks at that time. I hadn't thought of it, but I wondered, was this kind of an early sign of, there weren't that many option quarterbacks out there at that point? Like, because, these things kind of trickle up in terms of like, we know spread football's coming. Started in high school level really and starts moving up. So maybe there was a piece of that, like, and we always heard talk then of like, well, what guy wants to go play in an option offense in college if he wants to play in the NFL? It doesn't get you ready. So I think those things might have been starting to percolate, but at Ohio, they weren't running the triple option. That said, I think most years there over the past decade at least, so they're kind of running a conventional spread type of attack. Their quarterback, I think, was first or second in rushing most years. So to your point, it remained a very quarterback centric offense. I think when you look at the Ohio years where they were successful. It's a different level of success than what is expected at Nebraska. Might have just had a little bit better luck finding quarterbacks there, or there might have just been more of them available if you're running an offense that's less of an outlier than the triple option was come, say, 2000.
Right.
That's
Mike,
one of
any
the
thoughts
things
on
that made Osborne so successful as he was, is his willingness to adjust when he saw the need to. His first years as coach, you had Vince Ferragamo, you had David Hum, I think his last year or whatever, guys that threw the ball, and Tom had been a receivers coach. But he got to the point where he saw, hey, in order to be successful in the Big 8, you got to play the way Oklahoma plays. And so you start working towards the option. You start recruiting quarterbacks. Jeff Quinn was a running type quarterback. Nate Mason, and then Turner Gill was a critical quarterback in the development of that option offense. Same way with the defense. You lost 7 bowl games in a row to teams that threw the ball, and Tom realized that, hey, to do this, we've got to change from a 50 front to a 4-3 defense with speed. And you recruit a guy like Ed Stewart, who's a defensive back, and you bring him in and you make him a linebacker, and he's an All-American linebacker, and he can run, and you have success against these teams that you didn't have success because Tom's willing to adjust. And I think that's important for a coach. You've got to be able to adjust in order to be successful. And sometimes people look at Tom and say, he was stubborn, whatever. No, he wasn't. He was very detail oriented, and he was willing to make changes when he saw the need to do that.
Now there's a fun hypothetical. If Nebraska had been in the Big Ten this whole time, what offense would Tom Osborne have run? Because the story is that Nebraska's option was basically kind of a response to the wishbone running wild through college football. Interesting. Nobody write that up. I want to first crack at that.
Yeah, Brandon, that sounds like a perfect counter read newsletter.
There you go.
I'll give it a shot.
Speaking of hypotheticals, Brandon, you kind of already mentioned it, that no matter what, if they're winning 9 games, they're probably, at this time, they were probably going to have to fire a coach. But hypothetically, what if it wasn't 9? Let's say it was 10, maybe 11 wins, double-digit wins. They're playing for conference championships and maybe even winning them. Hypothetically, maybe they're not winning the big one, the national title. Do either of you think that would have been good enough for Nebraska fans at that point, or would that still not satisfy that hunger or that need that we were looking for back then?
I think it would be tough because I look at the entirety of Tom Osborne's career, 25 years, and a lot of people look at it as it was just like a straight line right up to those national championships at the end of his coaching career, and it wasn't. There were a lot of ups and downs in Tom's during Tom's tenure as head coach. He most notably interviewed for the Colorado job in '78. There were a couple of other instances where it's like, hey, I don't know whether Osborne ought to be the coach or not, because he's not. There was the anecdote about coming back from one of the bowl games on the plane. One of the regents said to Tom, it's a good thing you won that bowl. Was it the Liberty Bowl? Because if you hadn't, things would be whatever. And so I don't know if that would be enough because of the context. It certainly would be from a reasonable standpoint. If you got to the point where you won 11 games, you might be in a position where you could play for a national title. At least you were nationally relevant. And that was something that you're playing against again, because if you look at Tom's career, a majority of the seasons that he was coach, at some point in the season, I'm not saying at the end, but at some point in the season, you could have said, hey, Nebraska could be a national championship contender here because where it's at, and then it played Oklahoma and it fell apart. No. But that's the thing. If you could get to 11 wins, I think you're feeling pretty good, because you have a chance. You're just not winning 9 games every year, and you're going up 10, 11. at some point. You don't have to do it every year, because I don't think you could at that point. Regardless of who your coach is, I don't know if you could.
Yeah, I think conference titles are the key. I think the conference title drought here plays a big role too. So, if we, in a hypothetical world where Solich doesn't get fired and he's on for 3 or 4 more seasons, if he gets a conference title in one of those, then I think it's potentially more than 3 or 4 seasons. You reset the clock. Same thing with, as we'll see with Bo Pelini. If he gets one of those, it changes the tone of things considerably. Depending on which one he would have gotten. And if you get 2, then who knows? Like he gets fired in 2014, and we know that there was big friction there between Bo and his boss, Sean Eichhorst, and maybe that's enough on its own. But you deal with a lot more friction if you've got a guy who's won a conference title in the last 5 years, much less 2 potentially.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brandon. And I think for Nebraska fans, especially of a certain era, it felt like a birthright. We were going to win the conference, or come close, and we're going to play in a New Year's Day bowl, right? And like a major New Year's Day bowl. Right. Not the Holiday Bowl or whatever. Like, we're going to play in the Orange Bowl. We're going to play in the Sugar Bowl. We're going to play in the Fiesta Bowl. And obviously, that didn't happen every year. But I do think that would have made a difference. I will say this though. My recollection, we all know this, when we were growing up, guys, especially for those of us who can remember prior to 93 and 94, Osborne was not appreciated. He couldn't win the big one. Right. And so he was winning 9 or 10 games a year, and winning the conference. And even then the natives were restless, to your point, Mike, about it being much more of kind of up and down than people remember, people characterize it as now. And so, we talk a lot this year about the 2024 season. Matty O's line is 8-4 in 2024. That's our election year slogan for Matt Rule's second year. And I think all of Husker Nation would be thrilled with 8-4 this year. And so I sort of wonder, I sort of wish we hadn't had to live through some of the awful seasons of the recent past, but I sort of wonder if only with that perspective are we able to have a little bit more of a level head as fans. To your point, Brandon, I think I sort of wonder if 9 or 10 wins consistently would have been enough, especially if we're only winning the conference instead of every other year. Maybe it was every 5 years or every 8 years or something like that. Husker fans really, it's why I love being a Husker fan. It's why I love other Husker fans. Our expectations are still insane, given it's because of basically the Devaney era through the early Solich era. We have these ridiculous, outlandish expectations, but it's why we're such awesome fans. But it's also a bit of a curse when we talk about just trying to enjoy this team that we love.
Yeah.
Right. Anyone over. Sorry, go ahead, Brandon.
I was just say a good modern example, if anyone's looking for one, I think, is Ohio State in 2024. You can't argue with Ryan Day's record at all, but he hasn't won the conference in 3 years. He enters this year where he can maybe lose the Oregon game. He sure can't lose to Michigan. And given what Ohio State's done in the transfer portal and always recruiting wise, they hired UCLA's head coach to be their offensive coordinator. They know it happens to be Chip Kelly. It's like win it all or get out, or better minimum win the Big Ten. So anyway.
Yeah. Matty, what were you say?
I don't remember. It was there and then it was gone.
It's gone now.
It looked like a really great point. It looked like
it was an amazing. Yeah. It was an amazing point.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. All right, guys. Mike, any final thoughts from you, sir?
Somebody mentioned 8-4 this year for the Huskers, and people would be happy. They would be happy because they was like, well, there's 8-4 now. What's going to happen next year? Because
that's exactly
it's moving up.
That's exactly.
Better not be 8-4 in 2025, or we got problems.
That is
right now we're on the upswing.
Yep.
So 8-4 is good in a bowl game.
Yeah.
But that just is one step. We're going beyond.
Yeah.
That is spot on. Spot on. Brandon, any final thoughts from you?
A random one. when I was talking about, there were some signs, I think, that maybe in addition to the things we're talking about with Solich, 44 takeaways in 2003 is, like the loss to Colorado, is such an outlier that I almost like mentally discount that 03 record a little bit. If you're curious, FBS record is 57 takeaways in this season. 1970 Tennessee did that in 11 games, got 8 more in the bowl game. They're 65 takeaways in a 12-game season. They went 11-1. So, yeah. And kind of a hint, maybe a hint in that 02 or 03 season. Can't argue with 10-3, despite being plus 44. But the losses were like really catastrophic losses, which should come back around in 2 coaching cycles with the DC at that time.
Yes.
I'm sorry if I'm being thick-headed, Brandon. Are you saying they overperformed because of the 44 turnovers?
Maybe. I'm not
okay.
saying it. I'm
suggesting
asking the question.
Okay, putting it out there.
So maybe more like a 7-win team that, got a couple extra wins from getting that ridiculous amount of takeaways.
Possibly.
All right. Absolutely fantastic discussion, gentlemen. Thanks to each and every one of you. This concludes episode 1 of the Reckoning series. Stick around next week. We will examine the question of, would Bill Callahan have worked with more time? Really excited about this whole series. We're going to be looking at every coaching era since Tom Osborne retired. We got a lot of great guests lined up. So stick with us, Common fans. In the meantime, as always, GBR for life.